Once you were old enough, what were the dark family secrets you were finally let in on? My father was married with another woman before meeting my mother. They had a daughter and my dad loved her so much his wife started going crazy jealous. My dad noticed some strange behavior she had towards the girl, and when he tried to talk to her about it, she started arguing with him. He then left with his daughter to my uncle's house. She knew my dad would left the girl with my aunt while he was at work, so she called the police and said my aunt kidnapped her child. The police came in and took the girl away from my aunt. She immediately tried to call my dad, but the woman drove back home, put poison in her daughter's milk, and forced her to drink it. When my dad arrived, he found his daughter already dead and left alone. The woman was never ever found. My dad had never had justice for his first child. Kinda sad. Then when I was born my mother didn't mind to name me after my sister. We share the same name, and that's actually how I found it out. I asked my parents about my name, and they told me the whole story. Edit, typos. That's so messed up and sad, and a lot of baggage for them to carry around. I'm sorry, but I hope they cherish you, and hope they don't put too much pressure on you, because you share your late half-sister's name. Thanks for your concern, but this whole name thing lost meaning after my parents divorced, and my stepmother plagiarized my name. How can I explain it? Think my name is Mary Jane, well she named her daughter something like Mari Janie. Same but different. My half-sister is amazing, but I hate her mother because of this. By the way guys, if you are enjoying this video so far, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It will help us out quite a bit, and if you don't enjoy the videos in the future anymore, you can always unsubscribe. Let's get back to the video. Got a Facebook message from one guy asking if I was related to my dad, since it's not a common last name. I thought he was a fan of his work because I was in college at the time and the guy was about the same age as me. And that's how I found out my dad slept around and that I had a half brother the same age as me. Are you guys friends now? No. There are nice stories. I had a coworker reunite with her birth family and they got along great, but this is more of a worst case scenario. I, who had greatly admired my dad up until that morning, gave quite the panicked anxious call to him about this new information. He told me the guy and his mom were psychos and I should not talk to them. I asked him if it was true and was given a not reassuring maybe. The guy was probably perfectly nice and wanted to get to know me and stuff, but I was having an incredibly difficult time processing all of this. He had also contacted my younger full biological brother, again, rare last name. I blocked the new half brother because I couldn't deal with it. My dad had also told us not to tell our mom about it. So suddenly the secret was our burden to bear. And I know for sure it tore me apart for the next 8 years or so. I finally caved and told my mom, and she said she already knew. I hope it was my younger biological brother who had told her, because I still consider this whole ordeal a contributing factor in his. So, I'm here, but I just really don't want to have anything to do with the guy. We never met, never knew each other, and while he really didn't do anything wrong, I just associate him with grief. My grandfather killed his youngest brother to get out of going to Vietnam. He, his brother, and 2 of their friends had their numbers called in the draft for Vietnam. They didn't want to go, obviously, but they didn't come from money and or work to support their families. If they got arrested they'd lose their jobs and their families would lose their income. So they decided on a different plan to get out of going. They would drive to get their medical checks together, and on the way there they would drive the car into a tree. The plan was to get too injured to get sent to war, but not so injured as to be permanently crippled, and it had to look like an accident so nobody got arrested. This was in country Western Australia, so they were all going to say they swerved to miss a kangaroo and hit the tree. My grandfather was driving, his friend was in the passenger seat, and the other 2 were in the back. His brother was behind the passenger seat. They hit the tree doing about 40 km/h, enough to be serious. a broken leg for my grandfather, a broken arm for the guy behind him, and broken ribs all around. They definitely weren't going to war. The problem was that for maximum impact, and because this was rural Australia in the 60s, they weren't wearing seatbelts. And nobody found them, or their car for an hour or so. And nobody considered internal injuries in this plan. And my grandfather's brother bled to death from a ruptured spleen in the back seat. He was dead before they got to a hospital. My grandfather never forgave himself, and he never talked about it. My grandma was the only one he ever told, as far as we know, and she didn't tell my mother and I until long after his death. We found a small box in their bedroom when we were cleaning out the house after she died last year. It had a clipping from the local newspaper at the time about the accident. It said that they had swerved to miss a roo and called it a tragedy. I don't think my mother told any of her siblings, so technically this is still the family secret. I guess now you're all in on it. I was told that my mother's older brother had died in an accident. He was intoxicated and got run over by a train. A whole bunch of unfortunate circumstances etc. My grandmother often mentioned it with sadness because she considered him a brilliant boy, very handy and had a hopeful career in arts. He was a teenager when he died. However, every time this story came up, my mother's face hardened and she never spoke about it herself. I could kinda sense that there was something left unsaid, but I was a kid, so I didn't really question the story. My mom finally confided in me about a year ago that she was by her brother and that it was not an accident, but a My grandmother has no idea. This whole situation is tragic on so many levels. I hate to ask a ton of questions, but this one stuck with me. When you say your grandmother has no idea, are you just referring to the part, or also the fact that he committed? Also, what does your mother feel about the memory of her brother? I just wonder if she still resents him for what he did and is mainly sad for your grandmother who lost a son, or has she forgiven him and is saddened by his death and that she never got closure? I'm also curious if his a direct link to possible guilt he had for what he did to her. Sorry I asked a bunch of questions and I know that you probably don't have the answer to many of them as it's probably extremely difficult for your mom to talk about. Just certain things stay with me and I get insanely curious. I've always been an Aussie bastard. Anyway, I'm so sorry for everything your mom went through and I'm glad she's doing well now. It's okay, I'll gladly answer. I haven't spoken about this to anyone other than with my mom and didn't realize how heavy this actually weighed on my mind. Unraveling this in front of internet strangers is kind of therapeutic. Apologies for the formatting, mobile, and for odd sentence structures here or there, not my first language. Anyway, my grandmother does not know about She knows that it was probably but is kind of in denial. To her, it was an accident that cost her a son. As my grandma is now in her 80s, my mom thinks it would be too traumatic for her to reveal all this. Regarding your third question, it would be impossible to know for sure if the was directly linked to the guilt. Based on what I know, I'd say yes. My uncle was 16 when he died, and my mom was 12. Apparently for the past few years up to that point, the had become more rare, and it horrifies me to type this out, but it was most likely because my mom was reaching her teenage years, her body was changing etc. Since they were both growing up, it had probably become something too sickening for my uncle to live with. Coupled with strange moods, according to my mom, he had become depressed and his behavior erratic, early alcohol abuse and a few more family traumas. It does not seem like a stretch. Overall, my mom doesn't resent her brother, but she regrets that she spent decades blaming herself, both for the and the She has happy memories of him as well, but since they are kind of tainted, she prefers to just not think about her brother at all. She also lost her father a few years later, so it was a tough time for her, and she'd rather put it all past her. My grandparents ran a boys' home in the 60s and 70s for kids with unsafe living situations, family, juvenile criminal records etc. It was well run, and they provided the kids with a good life. My mum was an only child and grew up living around them. When I was small and asked her about it, she would say that for the larger part she loved growing up around them because it was like having friends all the time. In the pictures that exist of her from that time, she looks like a little boy herself. She refused to wear girls' clothes and had a boy's haircut. But in all of these photos of her, throughout her childhood and adolescence, there is a strange sad energy in her face that I couldn't put my finger on. Even though she is smiling, I could just feel it when I saw those pictures. I didn't understand how she would describe these times as so fun and happy, but when my grandma would say she had heard from one of the boys around Christmas, Easter, or birthdays, my mum would go quiet and look close to tears and maybe stay this way for a day or so. My mum was an extremely overprotective mother when I was a teen. At 14 I wasn't allowed to shave my legs, pluck my eyebrows, wear anything that wasn't a learner bra. Nothing terrible, but it felt like I was being kept as a child. At 15 I rebelled a bit, and my mum clamped down even harder. She would emphasize over and over that boys were not to be trusted. They only want one thing: girls that give off certain messages to them will "come a cropper." The horrible twist is that I was assaulted by men on 2 separate occasions in my teens, and when I told her, she basically said to me "I told you so." I went through therapy a bit later and managed to process that these things weren't my fault and that my mother's logic had made things worse. I confronted her with this: those events were not my fault. It was nobody's fault but the perpetrator. I did not do anything that invited assault. She really could not accept this. It had to be my fault in some way. When I went to the police to make a historical report, she was extremely awkward and unsupportive. My dad stepped in to help me during this time. 2 years later, during an argument, my mum tells me that she was groomed and assaulted from the age of 6 by 2 separate boys in their early adolescence who were living at the home. She didn't realize anything about this was wrong until her father saw something happening to her, blamed her, implied she caused it to happen, told her mother, said it must not happen again. My mum was 8. Nothing happened to the boys, who had likely been themselves. The home carried on working for years and no one said anything more about it. When my mum told me this, I just held her and told her it wasn't her fault, that her parents should have protected her when they knew that was happening, that she should have been better cared for. When she told me, I felt no shock. It felt like I had always known. The sad feeling I could see in those pictures of my mum when she was little, and how she had so desperately tried to protect me from growing up, suddenly all made sense. My grandpa was alcohol addicted, and the biggest he was a terrible father and husband. He beat my mom and my 2 uncles and my grandma, had them terrified every time he came home from drinking somewhere, had them hiding for hours under their bed, until he finally passed out. My grandma had and almost died when she was like 40. My mom had to take care of her all by herself, and she visited her in the hospital that was like an hour away. All she ever heard from her dad, aka my grandpa, was that he hopes that the B*TCH just finally died. My mom was 17 at that time and also had to accomplish her apprenticeship at the same time. Most of the people in the city we lived knew who my grandpa was because he had some job that was somewhat important. IDK, everyone always just recognized by my last name that he has to be my grandpa, and they all always talked about how much they liked him and how happy I have to be to have a grandpa like him, and blah blah. People knew nothing about him. I know for a fact abusers hide themselves to others and have a charming personality. It sucks, and I doubt people will believe you when you tell the truth. Oh my god, this is almost identical to my family. That's so weird. Only differences are that 1. My alcoholic grandpa wasn't necessarily just very detached. They never feared him. 2. My mom was only 12 or 13 when her mom got sick, so she just worried about taking care of the house and her little sister and her dad, aka meals, cleaning, laundry, schoolwork. 3. My grandparents loved each other very much, and my grandpa was actually hospitalized after he had a psychiatric episode, bipolar, while my grandma was going through treatment. Similarities are still very odd though. Mine is more cool. That horrifying on the sense I'm proud of this one. My grandfather was an amazing guy. He was a sniper paratrooper in WW2. Always refused to talk about the army. I learned later that he was dishonorably discharged after injury. Turns out the sergeant in his squad was an absolute He had to go behind enemy lines to set a post up, and the plane was flying too low for a safe jump. He protested it to the sergeant, who proceeded to shove him out of the plane after calling him a coward. Both my grandfather and his spotter partner were seriously injured in the landing. His partner never knew him, was paralyzed and lost a leg. My grandfather broke both of his arm, hand, and some ribs. They both were rescued shortly after and taken to a military hospital. That's not what got him discharged, though. Turns out the sergeant showed up to visit them in the infirmary, and my grandfather punched him square in the face with his only good hand, twice. If his only army buddy we ever knew is to be believed, he was also visiting at the time, he floored the After that, and on top of his injuries, the army sent him home for the rest of the war. We found out later after he passed, and we had to go through his stuff. A bunch of newspaper and article clippings about the folks involved he had kept. The sergeant was also discharged after a similar incident cost the lives of 2 other members of his squad a year later that weren't so lucky. The man apparently drunk himself to death years later. We found all these written but unsent letters to his sergeant. We found photos of my grandfather's squad and the 2 that died with him. It was heartbreaking. I never knew any of this. He was such a fun, kind, and goofy guy. You'd never think anything like this would happen to him. Now I knew why my parents always said never to bring my up the army around him. Miss you, grandpa. I'd have punched too. When I was about 10, my cousin and his dad died. I always thought it was an accident, and on the same day. When I was old enough, I was told that his dad actually committed. My cousin followed him couple months later. Truly devastated me, although I didn't know them well. Edit. Thank you for the warm words, and also for sharing your similar stories with me. I've read all the replies. My grief is still there, because I understand that with professional help both would maybe still be here today. It just wasn't common to seek help back then. I hope all of you are well. I'm so sorry. I know of a similar story. When I was a senior in high school, 2006 to 2007, one of my classmates lost her dad over winter break. Poor girl was so close to him, and it took her a couple of months to feel mentally okay enough to come back to school. She had just gotten back into a regular school routine when one day, she was pulled out of class. Her older brother had committed. That was it for her, and she finished her schoolwork at home for the rest of the year. Obviously it was beyond devastating for her, her older sister, and their mother. And it broke our hearts that, while the rest of us were doing prom, prepping for graduation and college, etc., she was at home wrestling with deep grief. From what I can tell on Facebook, they are all doing well today, but man, I can't imagine what it was like to be the people most directly affected by that situation. That happened to me, but with a best friend. She wrote "I'm done" on Facebook, and then shot herself in her front yard, and died right there. She had a son who was in his last year of high school at the time. At 22 he shot himself in the head and died. Very devastating for all. I still have no words to explain why they made those choices. When I was young I thought it was really nice that my nana lived with my aunt and her family, since she was getting on a bit, and it meant she was looked after and there were always people around. Aunt has 6 kids. Occasionally aunt would gripe about being the one looking after nana, since aunt is also one of many kids, and being young I sympathized, but given they all spent loads of time with nana too, didn't think it was a big deal. You don't think about financial responsibility when you're young, I think, just social and caring. Well, it turns out the reason nana lives with aunt is because aunt and her husband convinced nana to put the house in their name, so they could look after her affairs, and sold it out from under her, and invested the money in a pyramid scheme, so it's gone now. Because of this, her siblings refuse to give Aunt a penny towards looking after Nana, since it's her fault Nana has no money or assets, and instead pay to take Nana out all the time. Meals, shopping, activities so she doesn't go without, but they let Aunt struggle under the weight of Nana's general living expenses. Aunt's kids are all independent now, so they are not going to be impacted by money problems. Now I look back at her griping with annoyance and think what a terrible person she is. My aunt and cousin did something similar to my Nan. Nan passed with virtually nothing to her name because my cousin had been made her next of kin and controlled the bank account while allegedly receiving a carer's allowance for my aunt and the cousin that was complicit. The other two cousins have nothing to do with them, wound up moving to another state because they'd amassed one too many debts. They ripped my folks and I off. It was easy for me to cut them out of my life, but leaving their own mother and grandmother with nothing was beyond the pale. I'm glad your aunt's siblings do the right thing by your Nana. My grandmother was in a very relationship since she was 17. Since her then boyfriend was an alcoholic and forced himself drunk on my grandmother several times, she got pregnant, and since that was not done in the 50s, they had to get married as soon as possible. After their first child, they ended up having 4 more kids. One didn't survive childbirth, but the other 3 lived. During this time, my grandmother's husband was still an alcoholic and very She had to literally flee away from him, from her family to survive. She would definitely ended up dead if she didn't. She also met my grandfather during this time, and they fell in love. She left her kids with her mother, who had custody of the kids anyways. That's how they rolled back then. My grandfather sold the only thing he had, which was a small moped, so he could help her escape her husband. Many years later, when my grandma had divorced her husband, married my grandpa, had 3 more kids with him, grandkids etc, yay, and moved back to the hometown. They also had reconnected with her first 4 daughters and everything was going well, except for one thing. It was a tiny town, everybody knows everybody over there, and rumors spread fast. And there was a rumor about my grandmother from back in the days of her first husband. The rumor was that she had some sort of fling with another man in town, not my grandpa, and one of her first 4 daughters was his. The daughters didn't know about this until they asked my grandma about it, and she was flabbergasted. Told them it wasn't true at all, that it definitely didn't happen, and that this should be the end of it. It didn't sit right with the daughters, so they did a DNA test. And then the results came in. There it was, proof that the gossip wasn't actually gossip, but it was true. Daughter number 3 was a half sister of the other 3. So they went to my grandmother again. They showed her the proof. It said very clearly that one of them wasn't their father's. My grandma denied again, even tough they had it black on white that it was true. The daughters went no contact with my grandmother after this. They never got over the fact that she left them in the first place, and this betrayal was the straw that broke the camel's back. Can't really blame them for that. Still, to this day she claims it didn't happen, and that all 4 women are from the same man. My step-grandfather has always been an alcoholic. As a child he even taught me how to mix his favorite drink. As kid at like 6 years old I would mix his drink as he liked and bring it into him in the living room. Don't ask what the drink was a mix of, cause I literally can't remember, and my grandpa always acted funny. I always liked spending time with him cause I found him funny. So I never saw the bad side of his alcoholism, and he never made me drink or anything, so overall he didn't have any negative impact on me at all. But before I was born he could get so drunk he threatened to kill my grandma, and when he got in a car accident and came home he was bleeding badly from his head, and he started saying my granny shot him. He even threw out some of the wedding pictures my parents had. I never knew how horrible he was. Maybe cause he liked kids or something. He would make me cocoa and watch Garfield with me when I was a kid. He was never a bad influence in my life. So it was so weird to me when I found out these things about him. Before he died though, he really regretted drinking, and he completely stopped. He became really depressed too until his granddaughter, biological, was born. He was so happy about his granddaughter. He died regretting everything, and a sober man who was happy to have been able to meet his one and only biological granddaughter. Regardless of everything, he really changed in the end and everyone was really upset he died. This is the end of the video. Thank you guys for staying with me till the end. If you enjoyed watching this, you might as well watch these too.